So today we have got the Aston Martin DB12 and we've got its predecessor, the Aston Martin DB11. We're going to look at what's changed between the two cars and ultimately find out what's the better buy for you. So we'll start off with one of the most obvious changes, that is the name going from DB11 to DB12. Obviously, historically, all the Aston Martin DB bundles have been sequential, so moving upwards. One interesting point though, if you remember, Aston Martin never made a DB8, and part of that reason is because they didn't want people to get confused thinking you had a V8, obviously competing with likes of the V8 Vantage, so they skipped the DB7 all the way to the DB9, which of course both had V12s, but ironically, now we have the DB12, it only comes with a V8. Okay, so that leads us on nicely to talk about the two different engines or the engine choices that you had in the DB11. The other obvious thing to notice is the way you open the engine bonnet, clamshell bonnet on the DB11, but they've done away with that now to have a more traditional bonnet on the DB12. The big thing with the DB11 is that choice. So you had a V12 when it first launched, and then they brought out the V8 later on. This is actually the V8 version, but whereas on the DB12, this is only available with a V8. At the moment, there are no plans to bring out a V12 version of this, so don't expect to see it. But the big difference between the two engines is the power. So they are both the 4-litre V8 twin turbo, which was AMG based, but Aston Martin have really put their home print on this engine. Loads of tuning, totally bespoke to Aston, whereas the old engine was a little bit more AMG. So the power difference, 671 brake horsepower on this, that's massive amounts of power for a V8, and I think it's 150 brake horsepower more than the DB11 V8. So big difference there, loads more torque as well. Top speed I think is 212 miles an hour compared to 192 miles an hour. It's 0 to 62, half a second quicker. So look, it's pretty obvious that the DB12 is a way more powerful car and has a lot more performance. Okay, so now we're going to move on to some of the visual differences from the exterior. And I guess one of the first things you'll notice is that the DB12 is slightly wider. It obviously sits a little bit more upright as well. So it does have a bit more of a menacing presence from the front, where the DB11 is a little bit flatter. It sits a little bit lower. Obviously the front bonnet is sort of curving downwards. That's partly because of that clamshell bonnet. And you do get that partition here on the DB12 where the front bumper is separate to the bonnet. But the other obviously main difference is that front grille. So much bigger on the DB12. Part of the reason is all that extra horsepower. You need more air intakes, more coolers in there. So you do get that gobbier sort of front end, but it does look pretty aggressive, especially with that new bonnet, which is very, very muscular. You do now get the grills in the central part of the bonnet compared to the DB11 where they're on the sides, and then sort of taking it further back onto the side profiles of the car. Obviously this being a Volante, it's a bit of a harder comparison, but the main things, you still get that DB trademark side strake. The only difference now is you do get that little Aston Martin embossed on the DB12, slightly more sculpted side skirts on the DB12 as well. And then onto the rear end, there's actually not much difference here on the DB12 to the DB11. They haven't really changed an awful lot. They got the same design taillights, same exhaust pipes, but overall, I do think the DB12 has taken things to the next level. It is more muscular and more aggressive. Personally, I prefer it, but I do understand some people might prefer the slightly more subtle looks of the DB11. Okay, so onto the interior, and this is definitely where the biggest changes between the two cars are. We'll start off by looking at the DB11 and in particular this center console, because that's what's changed the most. On the DB11 you had this sort of iPad style screen which does look a little plonked on there. You do have the sort of drive, the transmission controls here, those circular buttons, which personally I always quite liked. I like the sort of simplicity and the clarity of them. You've got the engine start stop right in the middle. This area here with the climate controls, not amazing, and then you've got this sort of controls for all the infotainment, which is very, very Mercedes, that Mercedes command system, which maybe it's a little bit dated, but it did always work pretty well as far as I was concerned. You do get this sort of triple screen here for the behind the steering wheel, and the rest of the interior doesn't exactly scream luxury. I mean, this car has been spec'd with the carbon fiber interior trim. It's got the yellow stitching. The seats have got all the upgraded Nexus quilting. So this particular spec is pretty nice place to be, but without a lot of those options, it can feel pretty bland. There's quite a lot of sort of plasticky kind of materials, and it's not the most high-end, definitely not the best part of the DB11. Okay, so now onto the DB12 interior, and this thing has been completely revolutionized. Aston really have done an amazing job here. But just look at this center console, which is basically like floating, a bit like the Porsche 918 Spider center console, but you've got all this now beautifully integrated screens. Aston Martin have actually in-house developed this, so it's no longer anything to do with Mercedes, and they've developed a really great system. All the buttons just feel a lot more high-end. You've now got these little roller buttons which to change the volume, put the temperature up, which all feel very nice. The engine start-stop is now bang there in the middle, and you can now actually twist it to change the driving modes. Instead of the little circular buttons to change from reverse to drive, you've now got this little lever, which does feel a little bit more sporty. And again, this car has been spec'd out with all the carbon fiber interior again, which goes all the way through onto the doors. And on the Volante, on the DB12, you also get it on the back of the headrests here, just for that little added visual element when the hood is down. You've now got the singular digital screen, which does look a lot better than it did on the DB12. And the other thing is this car has been spec'd with something called the Inspire monotone sport seats, which is, I think, is a £9,000 option, which gives you all that beautifully diamond quilting all throughout on the rear as well. It really is just a lovely place to be, and I'd go as far to say I genuinely think this is one of the best interiors on any Grand Tourer on the market today, and even any supercar. So another thing that's changed on the DB12 is Aston Martin have now done away with their partnership with Bang & Olufsen. So the sound systems that used to be on the DB11, which I think were only standard on the DB11 launch editions, but were an option on all other DB11s, now Aston Martin have formed a new partnership with Bowers & Wilkins. They also make the sound systems for McLaren, and it is a truly world-class hi-fi system. So you get 15 speakers instead of 11. Bear in mind, this is the upgrade. I think it's just shy of £7,000, but I think worth every penny. You get subwoofer in the back, 3D headline speakers, and perhaps the easiest way of telling whether your DB12 has got the Bowers & Wilkins is this beautiful speaker grille in between the rear seats. So another change is the amount of driving modes. So on the DB11, there are only 3 driving modes: GT, Sport and Sport Plus, and the way to change those is just by selecting this button here. Whereas in the DB12, you now actually have 5 different driving modes. So you do still get the GT, the Sport and the Sport Plus, but you've now got wet mode, so for slightly more cautious driving, and you also now get an individual mode, so you can actually customize the different settings. But actually what the big difference is what Aston Martin call the bandwidth between the modes. So whereas on the DB11, the difference between GT and Sport Plus was fairly subtle, it wasn't really a drastic difference, whereas on the DB12, they've expanded that bandwidth, as they call it. So in GT mode, you get this really sort of soft, really comfortable, sort of perfect for cruising driving mode. And then you can turn to Sport Plus and the car just turns into a bit of an animal, and you really basically just get that supercar raw performance. Okay, so now we're gonna have a little sound test and see which car sounds better. Obviously the DB12 got a lot more power. Does that translate into a better noise, or is the new emission regulations gonna make the DB11 sound better? Let's give it a listen. So which one sounds better? Let us know in the comments. Okay, so just a couple more things I want to show you. One of them is actually how you get into the car. So even though they've got the exact same design door handle on the DB11, you do actually have to press it in to open the door handle and open the door. Whereas on the DB12, you can actually open the door handle with the remote which just flicks the door handle out, making it a little bit easier to get in the car. Okay, so another noticeable difference on the two cars is the wing mirrors. So first off, we'll look at how they actually fold out. So when you unlock the car on the DB11, a more traditional way of coming out. But on the DB12, this is a pretty funky new swivel design. So you unlock the car and they actually swivel around, which I think is pretty cool. The other big difference you'll notice, the DB11 mirrors are quite a lot bigger. And that's partly because the DB12 mirrors are completely frameless. So instead of the glass, which sort of sits within the wing mirror, the glass is really sort of a part of the wing mirror. So when you're actually adjusting the mirror, or you think you're adjusting the glass, the whole mirror actually moves around, which I think is a pretty cool feature. So the final thing I want to show you is the difference in the wheels and the brakes. So obviously there's new design of wheels, but the actual size is different. So on the DB11, there were always 20-inch wheels, and also you could not spec carbon ceramic brakes on the DB11. It was no option at all. Whereas on the DB12, you can now spec carbon ceramic brakes, and this car has got them. They're a £10,000 option, but they're obviously going to help with braking performance, reduce brake fade, and obviously they're quite a lot lighter as well. And you now have 21-inch wheels, so you can get the forged wheels, or you can get these wheels as a bit more of a classic design. And the other good thing about the DB12 is they've got these custom-made tires. They're Michelin S5 bespoke tires, specially made for the DB12, and they also include a layer of polyurethane foam, which actually helps reduce all that road noise. And finally, one of the most obvious changes obviously is the price difference. So the DB12 prices have gone up significantly from where the DB11 was. This car is now 7 years old. It's had some heavy depreciation, but that depreciation curve is nice and shallow now. This car is actually up for £80,000 and should actually hold its value pretty well going forward, whereas the DB12 cost just under £250,000. This is a very high spec, obviously a Volante, so it's even more expensive. But even though this car is a few months old, done a few thousand miles, we're actually asking £210,000, so a £40,000 saving off list. And yes, the car will continue to depreciate some, but you know, they are very rare in the market. This is the latest Aston Martin. It has got rave reviews from journalists, the way it drives, and I think it's actually very good value in the market today. Okay, so that's it. That's some of the changes between the DB11 and the DB12, but which one do you think is the better buy? Do you save your hard-earned money and go with the older DB11, or do you go with the latest thing, the DB12, that beautiful new interior, all that extra power? But we'd love to hear your comments. We've got loads more videos coming soon. We keep getting told we don't do enough, so we're going to try and ramp it up a little bit. So stay tuned, stay subscribed, and we'll see you again next time.